very much for coming to our final All Souls, I can take it off while I'm speaking, our final All Souls seminar for the term. And it's my great pleasure today to welcome our Astor visiting lecturer, Professor Reuben Miller, who has come all the way from the University of Chicago and only arrived yesterday, as I understand it. So he's doing amazingly well. Reuben is a sociologist, criminologist, and a social worker who teaches at the University of Chicago, where he is an associate professor in the Crown Family School of Social Work Policy and Practice, and a research professor at the American Bar Foundation. Reuben studies and writes about race, democracy, and the social life of the city. Today, he will be talking to us about his book, Halfway Home, which is based on 15 years of research and practice with currently and formerly incarcerated people and their family and friends. The book, if you haven't read it, is amazing. It's incredibly moving, and unlike many other academic texts, dare I say, it's easy to read and engaging. It's also quite harrowing. So I have to say, the other night when I was finishing reading it, I kept reading a chapter, putting it down, reading a chapter of Harry Potter because I'm a super nerd and was feeling incredibly tense. And then I'd read another chapter of Reuben's book. So it's, I have a copy. If you don't have a copy, you're more than welcome to borrow it. The book has already been garnished with many awards in the US, including winning the Association of American Publishers Prose Award for Excellence in Social Science and the Prose Award for Socio-Cultural Anthropology and Sociology. It's currently a finalist for the PEN America John Kenneth Galbraith Literary Award for Nonfiction and for the LA Times Book Prize in Current Affairs. So it's a fantastic book. I'm really thrilled that you came. Welcome. And I'll hand over to you. I have forgotten to say, anybody who's online, because we have a bunch of people online, because we're incredibly modern, please make sure you have yourself muted, obviously, and we'll follow the usual system now that if you have a question, please raise your little hand or type it in, and Samuel, who's handling all of that, will we'll let you read your own question out. There'll be plenty of time for people in the room to ask a question at the end, and I'm presuming nobody who has a laptop open actually is on Teams, because if you are, then we'll have feedback, but why would you be if you're in the room? So I will hand over to Reuben and put my mask back on.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mary, for the invitation, and to the good folks at the Center for Criminology. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you for folks online who are showing up. And so today I want to talk to you about what I'm calling mass incarceration's afterlife, about the journey home and what it involves, and about what I write about as a supervised society that we've erected. This is through US laws and policy. So this is going to be a US-centric talk. My apologies. It's where I do my work. But the premise is simple. I think that we have to reimagine the problem, especially its scale, and especially its reach into the lives of the poor, and especially the poor people of color, if we're ever to change it. Anyway, so I want to begin with how we think about the problem, and we'll borrow insight from two of my heroes. The first is James Baldwin. The second is Nina Simone. We'll begin with Baldwin. The year is 1965. It's October. He's famously debating William F. Buckley, a man called the father of American conservatism. This is at the storied Oxford Debate Society. The resolution: the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro. Now, this entire debate is on YouTube. You can check it out. And at the end of it, Baldwin wins. This is, of course, because Baldwin always wins. You can't lose if you're James Baldwin. Buckley's outmatched. The resolve: yes, of course, the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro, and there was an expense. There was costs involved, costs that go far beyond the practices of slavery. Of course, there was stolen labor because slave labor is stolen. And of course, there was exploitation. Slavery is exploited. But really, the question itself is absurd. It's 1965. We had a Voting Rights Act and voter intimidation, a Jim Crow South and redlining in the North. Whiteness, Baldwin said, was sustained through Black suffering. And in one of the most memorable lines in the debate, he reminds us of the Black condition. Here's what he writes, or here's what he says. Now, leaving aside all the physical factors one can quote, leaving aside the rape or murder, leaving aside the bloody catalog of oppression of which we're already too familiar. What the system does to the subjugated is to destroy his sense of reality. In the case of the American Negro, he says, from the moment you were born, every stick, every stone, every face is white. Since you have not yet seen a mirror, you suppose you are white too. But it comes as a great shock, around the age of 5 or 6 or 7, to discover that the flag to which you have pledged allegiance, along with everybody else, has not pledged allegiance to you. To see Gary Cooper, this was a famous movie star at the time, killing off the Indians, he says. You're rooting for Gary Cooper, but the Indians are you. This is Baldwin being Baldwin. William F. Buckley was simply overmatched. I and many others think Baldwin's mind is exquisite. But it's the next passage that I found particularly striking. It comes as a great shock, he says. To discover the country to which is your birthplace and to which you owe your life and your identity has not in its whole system of reality involved any place for you. The disaffection, the gap between people, only on the basis of their skins begins there and accelerates throughout your whole lifetime, he says. You realize that you are 30 and you're having a terrible time. You've been through a certain kind of mill. And the most serious effect of it is, again, not the catalog of disaster, the policeman, the taxi driver, the waiters, the landlady, the banks, the insurance companies. No, it's the millions of details, 24 hours out of every day, that tell you you are a worthless human being, he says. But it's not only that. By that time, you've begun to see it happening in your daughter, your son, your niece, or your nephew. You are 30 by now, and you have done, and nothing you have done can help you escape the trap. But what's worse, he says, is that nothing you have done, and as far as you can tell, nothing you can do, will save your son or your daughter from having the same disaster and from coming to the same end. The next hero is Nina Simone. It's 1962, a few years before. Miss Simone sits at her piano for a live recording of Cinnamon at the Village Gate nightclub in New York City. Moaning in the break, the drum and hand clap driving the beat, each keystroke expresses the urgency of the moment. Simone is slender and striking in a white sleeveless gown. Her features feel more pronounced. Her gaze focused, sometimes intense, sometimes directed toward the keys, sometimes toward her or her band or her audience. Her voice, full, deep, a complement of a series of jangling but precise chords she strums. Oh yeah, she sings. Oh yeah, her voice trailing, now accompanying the chords she plays with an intensity that's directed at all of us and no one in particular. She begins again, her audience on edge, this time the pitch a bit higher. Oh yeah, she sings. Now back to the keys. The sound and the tempo build, Miss Simone begins. Oh, Cinnamon, where are you gonna run to? Cinnamon, where are you gonna run to? Where are you gonna run to on that day? The song was recorded in 1962, as I said. This is 3 years before the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1965. Medgar Evers had not yet been assassinated in his driveway coming home from an NAACP meeting. 14-year-old Addie Mae Collins, 14-year-old Carol Denise McNair, 14-year-old Carol Rosamond Robertson, and 16-year-old Cynthia Wesley would not yet be blown to bits by a white supremacist at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. The same bomber did not, or on that same day, a police officer did not yet murder 13-year-old Johnny Robertson, and 16-year-old Virgil Ware was not murdered by a white supremacist coming home from a rally in the same city on that same day, nor had their lives yet been lost to history. But Black life was no easier in 1962 than it was in 1963, when more people paid attention. And it was no easier in Birmingham than it was in Harlem, or in Bronzeville in Chicago, or in Black Bottom in Detroit. Where will Cinnamon run and hide to escape judgment that is all around him? He has sinned, which is to say he's amassed a debt. He has to repay it. Les Baxter will record a show tune cover a decade before, where Cinnamon runs to the moon. But this is a Negro spiritual, one that's been sung in Black churches since the turn of the 20th century, and whose roots run much deeper. It's a song that should be sung with a tambourine. It's a warning and a call to prayer. The church must get right so we can go home. And this debt is a real one. The philosopher and polemicist Friedrich Nietzsche tells us that the origins of guilt, what he calls bad conscience, comes from the material relationship between a lender and a debtor. The debtor, shall he fail to pay what he owes, offers the lender his very flesh, or the flesh of his wife, or the flesh of his children, to do with as he will. It is a sign of his free will to offer the one thing over which he has mastery, that is his body. The lender takes pleasure in torturing the debtor, and at the same time, he sears his conscience. The pain he inflicts will never be forgotten, and the debtor and all who see his pain will pay their debts from that point forward. This is not far from a distinctly American theological tradition where a sin-sick world, where sin-sick souls owe debts to their God. In sinning, they've broken a contract, one that must be repaid. They must pay with their flesh. This song was sung on the tail end of the long 19th century. The survivors of the lash, they sang it, and they will continue to sing it through the coming Great Depression. If slavery was punishing, the hunger and disrespect that followed was nearly as bad. Miss Simone's version was like the one our great-grandmothers sang, like the ones our great-aunts would hum. It was a song of fire and smoke strummed on bass guitars and well-tuned pianos, but the hand clap was reminiscent of washboards and her moans of red lines, cotton thorns, and slum clearance. The sinner man runs and hides on earth, not the moon. His punishment comes from this world, not outer space. It comes from the southern horrors that Ida B. Wells famously chronicled. It comes from the long trek north and the crack of the police baton in Harlem and in Bronzeville and in Black Bottom. It is the sting of eviction and of unsolved rapes and murders. It is the experience of unemployment and hunger, all while hearing from preachers and politicians and social scientists and do-gooders that move in and out of your neighborhood with their surveys and their cameras and their best intentions in tow, that it's really your fault. It's your refusal to snitch, they say. It's your inability to maintain a traditional family form, they say. It's your inability to raise your children or to delay gratification or to shake off the deficits of your culture that put you in this position. It is your social disorganization, sociologists are fond of saying, or your disbelief in the legitimacy of the law, so say criminologists. It is your legal cynicism. At the end of the day, it's you. This version was recorded live at the Village Gate nightclub at the corner of Thompson and Bleecker Street in Greenwich Village. The song's protagonist, the sinner man who seeks respite on Judgment Day. And the song asks, "Oh, sinner man, where are you going to run to avoid judgment on that day?" He runs to the rock, to the river, to the sea to ask for help, and eventually he even runs to God, saying, "Please hide me, please help me, Lord." But sinner man finds no respite. The river boils, the sea bleeds, the rock says, "I ain't going to hide you, God." And God says, "Go to the devil." Sinner man, of course, is disappointed. He says to the rock in protest, "What's the matter with you, rock? Can't you see I need you, Lord, 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 on that day?" The rock cries back, "I won't hide you," he says. 3 times, "I won't hide you. I ain't gonna hide you, God, on that day." He runs to the Lord, and the Lord refuses the sinner man. But the sinner man says to him, "Don't you see me praying? Where were you when I needed you, Lord, Lord, Lord?" But God responds, "Where were you when you should have been praying?" And he sends the sinner man to the devil, who, of course, is waiting. In this parable, constructed from the traditions of the Southern Black church, the sinner man knows that the devil will never be satisfied with his torment. That is, he knows that no amount of violence inflicted on his body will ever be enough. He cries out, "Power, power to the Lord," acknowledging what is a matter of fact. The fate of the sinner man is in the hands of his enemy, the devil. Simone's prophetic lyric, like Baldwin's always timely discourses on race and the human condition, better than most capture the social situation of formerly incarcerated people today who find themselves at the mercy of others but rarely find mercy. If we stop for a minute and think about how we've written and think about them, we would admit that we view incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people as pathology. At least that's how we write about them, as dependence and deficiency and laziness and danger and amorality in the flesh. We see the so-called criminal as all that is wrong in the world, and we treat them this way. For the formerly incarcerated living in the post-civil rights era, there are few, if any, open doors in the labor market, housing, or even within their families. And just like the sinner man's confession of power when confronted with the power of his adversary, the devil, the admission of legal guilt is brought about through rejection and exclusion, not fact-finding, not through deep introspection, but by the power and force and weight of the crime control apparatus that comes down upon them and their families. The river boils, the sea bleeds, the rock and God reject the sinner man, while social service agencies have waiting lists, affordable housing options are scarce, and employers, landlords, and their family members reject formerly incarcerated people at every turn. This is due in part to the proliferation of electronic background checks, the advent of what Sarah Lagerson has theorized as a kind of digital punishment, and what Susila Gurusamy has described as a carceral web, where Experian alerts don't come through our emails and text messages when there's a data breach or when our information has been sold to, for example, Cambridge Analytica, but they do when a so-called sex offender moves a few miles away from our home, or when someone on a violent offender registry moves within our neighborhood. What's worse, their confession does not absolve them of sin, but it instead brands them. This is a digital scarlet letter that marks the conventional citizen as criminal. It marks them for life, sentencing them to punishment for a lifetime. This is whether or not they've completed their sentences. This is hence Simone's lyric, "The devil is waiting." But to more fully capture what life is like under these conditions, I think we have to turn away from our impulse to focus on the violent apparent in what we might call our criminal legal archive. Put differently, while we must acknowledge the formal mechanisms of exclusion, if we want to know what life is like for the wretched, and to more fully theorize social life in the era of mass supervision, we must, following Saidiya Hartman, a prominent scholar of slavery, try to encounter the wretched in what she calls a state of freedom, or at least in the moments of freedom they manage to steal away under the suffocating realities and everyday violence emblematic of what we might call the carceral condition. That is, we must map the contours of their increasingly supervised life. We must do this. And we must note how social and formal legal controls constrain their lives. But if we want to better understand the worlds that they inhabit and how it's been shaped, we must look at the informal mechanisms that change the way they live from day to day. We must turn away from the prisons, the courts, the law, and the police if we're ever to see how laws, police, prisons, and court practices get taken up outside of the criminal justice system, that is. We must move beyond and look outside the criminal justice system if we're ever to grasp its full scale, is what I'm saying here. We must observe how the subjects of crime control make lives for themselves, despite their treatment, if we're ever to fully understand the consequences of crime control in their lives. So to do this, I think we have to look at the formal, but we must look at the formal with an eye toward the informal. So let's start with the contours. Mass incarceration has enjoyed a space in the public imagination that it hadn't enjoyed before, not just because the term was used most forcefully in the late 2000s, but because people just weren't paying attention to jails and prisons. This is before the best-selling book, The New Jim Crow, and a series of protest movements that sprung up around and about questions of incarceration and the treatment of poor Black people at the hands, for example, of the police in the United States. Now we've had sitting presidents come out against mass incarceration. That happened for the first time in U.S. history. In fact, with President Obama even going to prison to visit a federal penitentiary, it hadn't happened before. And then a new law and order president came in, still talking about mass incarceration, still with even reform on his lips, though in a different way. All this to say that the public is thinking about incarceration in ways that it hadn't before. This is one of the world's most famous graphs. This is the graph of folks who've been arrested and incarcerated, over a series of years, including beginning in 1972, when we see in the United States, at the least, an increase in the rate of incarceration and the number of people held in the U.S. jail or prison every year for 27 straight years. This is what we call mass incarceration, the mass of it being, of course, wholesale incarceration of groups. We know that Black men, poor Black men, are overwhelmingly represented. I'll talk about that in a second. And when we think about race and mass incarceration, we know that Black folks specifically are twice as likely to be arrested, are 5 times more likely to be incarcerated. They serve lengthier sentences for the same crime. This is 10% longer sentences in state facilities and 20% longer sentences in federal facilities. This is for the same crimes as their white counterparts. They're more likely to serve due to mandatory minimum sentences, and their criminal justice contact is disproportionate even with reported crimes in the area. And when we looked at things like the stop and frisk study, the likelihood that they would be arrested was disproportionate, even in relation to whether or not they had guns or contraband or something like that. So whether you're innocent, whether someone's been called, it does not matter. Black people in the United States are more likely to be arrested, more likely to be incarcerated, all for the same stuff, even if they haven't committed a crime at all. This is important. It's crucial. We must think about jails, prisons, police station lockup facilities, etc. Very important. But our focus on prisons and the police have left a curious yet equally historic phenomenon hidden in plain sight, the rise of what I write about as a supervised society, which I'll talk to you about in a second. And then there's mass supervision, what Scottish criminologist Fergus McNeil and his collaborator Crystal Baynes have written about is mass supervision, or the community sanctions, has transformed the life worlds of the poor. But to understand this, we have to rethink the scope of the problem. So here's a bar graph, which means absolutely nothing out of context. But this is, I'm obviously not a quantitative scholar, but this bar graph represents the 2.3 million people who were held in American jail or prison a couple years ago. Right now, it's more like 1.8 million people. There's been adjustments for COVID, this kind of. But even this is eclipsed by the number of people on probation or parole in any given year. Folks in this room know, likely, that in the United States at the very least, but all over the world, I mean, the number of people on probation and parole is astounding. In the US, there are nearly 5 million people on probation or parole in any given year. This is twice the size of the jail and prison population combined. But even this figure, is exceeded by the number of people we process through a jail. So I'm cheating because I'm not a quantitative scholar. What I'm doing is I'm changing the unit of analysis. I'm moving from a point in time count to the number of people processed in a given year. But even cheating, 11 million people were processed through an American jail in 2008. That was the height of mass incarceration. Somewhere between 9 and 10 million people are processed through jails and prisons each year. So much larger than the jail or prison population on any given day. So much larger than the prison for sure. But even this figure is eclipsed by the number of people who are estimated to have a felony record. In the United States, 19.6 million people, a figure 10 times the size of the jail and prison population, are estimated to have a felony record, to live under the pressure of that felony record, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then in the US, even this figure is surpassed by the number of people estimated to have a criminal record of any kind. And so in the US, around 80 million people, something like 1/3 of all US adults, are estimated to have a criminal record of some kind. This is because in the United States, about half of all Black boys will be arrested before they turn the age of 23. We've known that since 2016, 49%. What's striking is that nearly 40% of all white boys will be arrested in the United States before they turn 23. But white people haven't been stripped from their innocence, and this is a fact that we don't talk about. And because we've racialized mass incarceration as a Black problem, because we think that crime is somehow located in the Black body, we don't see how this is a national problem in the US, but how it's a global problem across in other places. Not we don't see, but the discussion. There's no we, So what this tells me is that I think we live in something more akin to a supervised society, where people who've been arrested or incarcerated are managed across multiple sites by multiple actors, though the attention is largely paid to prisons, which is wonderful. We need attention paid to prisons. We have the world's largest prisons in the United States, but the carceral continuum is so much larger. And the communities where the action is. The mass incarceration, despite its place in the public's imagination, is one relatively small slice of a much more vast carceral network. We have to even rethink questions of what recidivism and arrest mean. If we think about it this way, if we think about the number of touches or how many people are touched by the criminal justice system and in what way. There was a Bureau of Justice Statistics report that came out in 2014 that was updated a few years later that followed 400,000 people released from American jails or prisons to figure out whether or not they recidivate. So it's a highly representative sample. It's occurred across about 30 to 50 United States. 400,000 people is a whole lot of folks. And what they found was that half were rearrested after the first year, about 33% within just 6 months. So this sort of justifies criminologists' concern with that first year out of custody. It's absolutely right. But when followed out over 5 years, they found that about 77% of the population recidivated. So almost everyone who went to jail or prison went back to jail or prison. Prison fails without question. There's no question. The study that was conducted a few years later, following that group for a few years longer, found that it was closer to 83% recidivate. So over 80% of folks who go to jail or prison in the United States come back. And that's striking, and that's important, and that's interesting. But almost half the sample, 44% of the sample, have been arrested 10 times or more. What does it mean to be arrested 10 times? How do you keep a job? How do you keep a promise? How do you maintain relationships with family? People do. It's through a Herculean effort to do so. What does it mean to be arrested 10 times? So to understand this, because I think our attention is in places it needs to be and not in other places where it needs to be as well, requires a radical doubt and a persistent proximity. I think we have to commit to getting really close to the everyday situation of people with criminal records to understand what's going on. I mean, we've got, on the one hand, social science that blames them for the conditions that they live in. This is not to say that people don't have agency or they don't make bad choices. That's not the point. But when the outcome measure is something like recidivism, and when recidivism rates are so high, everybody recidivates. Or if the outcome measure is something like arrest, and when arrest rates are so racially skewed, even for when one's committing the same crime, whether or not you've committed a crime or not, we have to ask new questions. We obviously don't understand in ways that may be fruitful for us if we want to crack this egg, the carceral condition. So my question is, what is it like then to live in this thing that I'm calling a supervised society? My work is a political ethnography of mass incarceration's afterlife. I'm interested in how power flows. I'm interested in the changing power dynamics between people and what it means to live under a legal apparatus that I'll talk to you about in a hot second. And I did my work in Chicago and Detroit and in New York City. In Chicago, I spent 3.5 years doing ethnographic field work in halfway houses, largely on the south and west sides of Chicago. In New York City, I followed groups of formerly incarcerated activists as they tried to mount campaigns to change the laws and policies that hem them in. And in Detroit, I followed people who were released from jails, prisons, and police station lockup facilities. No literature, or very little literature, on police station lockup facilities in the United States. And I followed people in Detroit for about 2 years through interviews, an interview-based study. And I want to know this question: what's basically life like for you under the conditions in which you live? And what are those conditions? This is a screenshot of what was the website for the National Inventory of Collateral Consequences of a Criminal Conviction. This was first tabulated by the American Bar Association. What they did was they counted the number of laws, policies, and administrative sanctions that targeted people with criminal records. So if you've got a felony record, what are the law and policies in your specific state? How many overall are there? But when they counted them, they found, on the first count, there were 48,000 laws, policies, and administrative sanctions that targeted people with criminal records. Now, that since winnowed down a bit, about 44,000, because reforms have happened, because legal definitions have changed, because they learned how to not double count. But there are about 44,000 laws, policies, and administrative sanctions that target people with criminal records in the United States. But the devil's always in the detail. All politics are always local. In my home state of Illinois, there are 1,400 of these laws, one state. This includes 583 laws that limit the acquisition of business licenses and property rights if you've got a criminal record. 556 that target employment, whole categories of employment for which one need not apply. 186 that limit political and civic participation. This regards things like, can you sit on the board of a nonprofit organization? Can you work in certain kinds of nonprofit enterprises? Will you pass something called the moral character clause if you're trying to apply for certain kinds of things? There are 54 that constrain family and domestic rights, literally dictating with whom you might live with. These laws look something like, if you've been convicted of a violent offense, you may not live in the home with someone who's adopted or with a foster child, for example. There are 21 that limit access to housing. 21 that limit access to housing. This is despite there only being, at least there were, just 2 federal guidelines for restrictions on housing for people with felony records at what we call HUD, which is anyways, it's our main sort of housing policy office. There were only 2 guidelines. One was methamphetamine production, the other was sex offenses. But most public housing agencies, or what you all might call housing schemes, public housing schemes, have taken this as a broad-based ban on people with federal records. With criminal records, so much so that cities like Chicago, New Orleans, LA, Houston, like these larger cities, engage in pilot programs to see what happens if you allow someone with a criminal record to just stay with their family without evicting them. What will happen? It's a pilot program. What will happen if we allow you to stay with your family is the question. And of course, the answer is they're less likely to be arrested, they have better health and well-being. Of course, that's the answer. But so much so that we need pilot programs for this. So what does this mean? It means in most states you cannot hold public office. In Illinois, you couldn't groom a dog if you were convicted a felony record. You may not adopt or foster a child. You may have to give up your parental rights. Something like 30,000 families lost the rights to parent their children for reasons other than child abuse or neglect in the United States. Not for child abuse or neglect. You may not live in public housing. Your job application may be denied. You may be fired or evicted on a whim. Your relationships, therefore, look fundamentally different. And here's where I'll key in. Herein lies the question of informality. The formal, this is the formal. Formal's wild. Somebody needs to study the formal. Let me study the formal. But right, like somebody needs to pay attention to the formal. But the informal is wild. It fundamentally transforms the nature of our relationships. These are the contours of Supervised Society. I haven't talked to you about things like conditions of release even. So when you get out of jail or prison, you walk into 44,000 laws, policies, administrative sanctions, and then you get handed a slip of paper that tells you, so those things you can't do. You get handed a slip of paper that tells you things you must do. There are things you can't do on the slip of paper too, like you may not cross state lines. I can't tell you in a state like Illinois, in a city like Chicago, that borders other states. So Illinois borders Wisconsin on one side, Indiana on another. And how many folks, for example, had a mother from Gary, Indiana, which is about 20 miles from Chicago, and she had a funeral. How many people get rearrested for going to the funeral without permission, for example? Well, you must not cross state lines without permission. You may not associate with known offenders. This is almost impossible. In a city like Chicago, in a neighborhood like North Lawndale, and I talked to you about the racialization of arrest and incarceration. In a neighborhood like North Lawndale in Chicago, the journalist Paul Street found that something like 80% of the men had criminal records. It is impossible not to associate. And association is a bedrock of democracy. The idea that one can come together, members of a like class can come together, or even different, but to get together to raise disputes against their government. So we're breaking a democratic precedent. It's a different question. But the relationships, but then there are things that you must do. You must report to a probation or parole officer. You must pee in a cup. You must pay for the urinalysis. We'll talk about this in a hot second. These things fundamentally transform the nature of everyday relationships for formerly incarcerated people, for their families. I believe it transforms the social life of the city altogether. So this was 30,000 feet in the air. And it has to be. I mean, these are statistics. Statistics, these are numbers. Numbers are abstractions. I mean, everything's an abstraction, but numbers are certainly an abstraction. This isn't really how people live. And I want to talk to you a little bit about how people live. And I want to just really follow one person. This is a man that I call Jimmy Caldwell. Jimmy's a short, affable African-American man in his mid-40s. I meet him at a place called the Detroit Reentry Center. This is a correctional facility that offers drug treatment when people are on their way out. It also offers a series of violence prevention trainings, and this is in the city of Detroit. So Jimmy was diagnosed with bipolar disorder in his late 20s and struggled for 2 decades with a crack and heroin addiction. Now he goes to jail, or first jail, then prison. When he gets to prison, a mental health technician takes him off his medication. He tells him, you've got a drug problem. You don't have a mental health issue. So it takes him off his bipolar medication. Jimmy spends 8 years in a Michigan prison without access to drug treatment or counseling. This is before he paroles. He does 6 of his 18 months at the parole facility, and he does drug treatment while he's there. He's released on the condition that he report to his parole officer for weekly drug tests, that he attend Narcotics Anonymous group meetings, that he complete a workforce development training program, and that somehow in between all of these things, he get a job. He's a generally happy man, but he breaks into sullen moods, crying often during his meetings with the parole officer, breaking into tears during our interview sessions. And unfortunately, his parole officer was a good one. She was perceptive. She saw that Jimmy was struggling, regulating his emotions. And so she suggested that he go to counseling, and he did. He got a psychiatric evaluation, and it was confirmed, of course, Jimmy had bipolar disorder. He's put back on his medication that they took him off of during that 8 years, causing suffering that I wasn't able to document. But I meet Jimmy at the Rosa Parks Transit Center. This is the city's main bus terminal, and shadowed him during his first appointment at the workforce development agency he's ordered to go to. It's February of 2014. It's one of the coldest days of the year. Jimmy's underdressed. He's wearing a black Detroit Tigers hat and a thin worn skull cap, or jacket and a thin worn skull cap. The address was just under a mile from the terminal, so we had to walk. He was overly concerned with my level of comfort. We're walking for about a half hour from where the bus line ends to where the building is. And he cracks jokes during this walk in February. And in Chicago, it's very cold in Chicago. I mean, this is below zero, like 2-degree days, one of those. And so we're walking to the Family Social Service Center. He's spending his time trying to put me at ease. He tells me no less than 5 times that he appreciates, quote, spending time with a brother like you, and that he's, quote, glad to do something positive. When we got to the address, this is a gray stone monstrosity not far from Midtown. I understood in a much deeper way why I went through those motions. The building was closed. It wasn't closed for the day, it was shuttered. There was a loose leaf printout taped to the door that had addresses for a few hopefully open workforce development agencies, but the closest one was 9 miles away. This is ironically close to the center, to the place where Jimmy was doing rehab work. This is the place where he slept at night because he did off-the-books demolition work and cleaned newly rehabbed properties for a real estate developer that used to be his dope dealer. There was no phone number on the printout for the agency we needed to go to, and Jimmy's phone had run out of minutes anyway. This is when cell phones had minutes. And Jimmy had ran out of minutes. He couldn't have called the numbers if there was one. The bus card that I gave him at our last interview had run out. And he was counting on a new bus card for me to get around for the week, and the $40 Visa gift card that I gave him as compensation for our interviews, to eat, to refill his prepaid phone card, and to get around. He also thought he could have gotten a bus card from the center if it was open, but of course it wasn't. If I wasn't with Jimmy, he would have had to walk 9 miles to the center or risk missing his appointment. Without the bus card I handed out, he would have to walk miles to the parole office for his weekly drug test, to his AA meetings or counseling, or he'd have to convince someone he knew with a car to give him a ride. He told me he could be sent back to prison for missing his appointments, and his fears were not unfounded. Not only did he know men who had been flogged, many of us had met people who had been sent back to prison before for similar reasons, but nearly a quarter of all prison admissions in the United States each year are for parole violations just like these. Missing an appointment, pissing hot, this kind of thing. And the price of violation is steep. People who get flopped have to finish their sentences, and Jimmy had 18 months left on his. Even if a parole officer didn't think the violation was serious enough to send him back to prison, he could be detained in what's called the eyedrop facility. This is a cell within the detention center where officers talk about, quote, laying the offender down. You can be held for up to 90 days, even if without ever being adjudicated, because the parole officer decides that this is the place where you need to be. Jimmy's careful work to ensure I was comfortable paid off, though. We walked back to the bus depot where my car was parked, and I gave Jimmy a ride, largely because he needed me to, but also because I was convinced that he was a nice guy in a bad situation. When we got to the Workforce Development Center, we learned that the training classes were full, though. He could not participate in them. There was simply no space in the class for him. He was told to put his name on the waiting list and come back the next week in case a parolee failed to show up. They didn't give out bus cards to people who were not yet in the program, and they could not guarantee him a spot in the next class. So we chatted with the service provider about opportunities available at the center, grabbed brochures on our way out the door, and drove to a Coney Island. This is a Detroit diner chain near his work site and temporary home. And it was there that we debriefed on our activities for the day. He thanked me profusely for the $7 lunch that I bought him, for the $40 gift card that I gave him in compensation for these interviews, and for, quote, being there. He thanked me for being there. But what did I do? There were so few places that he could turn to for help that he had to cultivate my trust. Like Centerman, his life moved from one rejection to another. The mental health worker refused him psychiatric care. The social service agency shut its doors. His only option was nearly impossible to get to without help. Without me, he may not have made his appointments that his parole officer required of him. But even with my help, the agency had no space. They could not accommodate his needs. All of this would have to be explained to his parole officer, who may or may not believe him, and he certainly would not believe him because this is an incredible story. Without his former dope dealer, Jimmy wouldn't even have a place to live, and homelessness, by the way, is a violation of parole. You must have an address to report from. Jimmy, like the Centerman, is almost completely at the mercy of others, depending on the kindness of strangers for food, for clothes, for shelter, on the mercy of the police, the courts, or the parole officer to stay out of jail or prison. He's even at the mercy of a well-meaning researcher who gave him a ride because I liked him. But if I told you the truth, I'd tell you I didn't like Jimmy very much, actually. He spent too much time complimenting me. I didn't trust him. I wasn't sure what he was up to. If I was being honest with you, I tell you that the real reason I gave Jimmy a ride home, not home, but to the Workforce Development Center that was closed, because I was cold. Jimmy got to the Workforce Development Center on my whim. People with criminal records in the United States live on the whims of others. And depending on how I feel from day to day or time to time, almost everyone they encounter has this new power over them to change the trajectory of their lives. It's powerful and awful. This is the power of third parties that emerges under what I call a supervised society, where everyone's a supervisor because everyone can withhold access to the life-giving institutions of a free society. Employers, landlords, criminal justice actors and agencies, licensing bodies and government officials, families, social service providers, almost everyone they come in contact with now has inordinate power over their lives, making life or death decisions for them and on their behalf, based on how they feel often in a given moment. This is due to interpretation of liability law that begins in the 1980s. Now, it begins much earlier, but we see kind of touchstone moment in the 1980s. And it starts in housing law, where an interpretation of the 1987 Drug Abuse Act in the United States, it's a federal act that says basically that public housing agencies have the power to evict people or to refuse access to leases for people with criminal records. And that people who live in public housing can be evicted even if the law that they broke was from many years before, even if the person who's not on the lease but is in the house living there has broken the law many years before, or even if they allow someone to visit who's ever broken a law. This is a 1987 law that metastasizes in 1996 during the State of the Union address from President Bill Clinton, who talks about the one strike rule is what he said. He said, we're going to take the fight to public housing. No more 3 strikes and you're out. We need a one strike rule where we can go after these drug dealers, these gangbangers, these criminal networks. Within 6 months of President Clinton's address, and the one strike rule gets adopted, of course, across housing agencies, but not just in housing agencies, public housing agencies, but also private housing agencies follow suit, of course. Within 6 months of President Clinton's address, the number of evictions based on criminal records has already begins to increase. The number of rejections of applications because of criminal records in public housing doubles. 6 months. So now, what happens in housing moves into other areas. We see the use of the good character clause for things like access to the bar if you're trying to be a lawyer, real estate licenses, dog grooming, all these things that we talked about at the very beginning of this conversation. So now there's stakes involved. If we go back to the housing examples, families now face eviction for housing a loved one who has a criminal record. Good landlords are viewed as people who would not give quarter to a so-called criminal. Overnight, grandmothers were being evicted for the crime of letting their grandchild sleep on the couch. What does this do to the nature of that relationship? Grandma who's going to be grandma, who's going to let grandson sleep on the couch. What happens when the son doesn't listen? What happens when the son stays out too late? What happens when the son drinks too much of the orange juice? This dynamic shifts. Now, employers, landlords, social service agencies, they're all made responsible for the actions of formerly incarcerated people. And so we see things like lawsuits, reputation loss from bad press. We see something called "not in my backyard." It's kind of acronym that people use to talk about how neighborhoods respond to undesirable things, like, for example, a social service agency that wants to set up there, something like that. But the stakes are even higher for people with criminal records because legal exclusion make them at once dependent on others. It's almost impossible to get a job. It's very hard to find a place to live. And the least desirable candidates to help. This is a largely unaccounted for vulnerability where arguments with a partner could equal a bout with street homelessness, where a problem with a coworker could equal the loss of a scarce work opportunity that was almost never there to begin with, a missed appointment, a pissing hot. So if you're in a state where marijuana is legal and you smoke some weed, you can go back to jail or prison for smoking weed. In fact, I can have a conversation about this, but I know people who've been sent back to jail or prison for drinking alcohol, which is not an illicit substance. A misunderstanding with a case manager can equal the loss of a job, all kinds of stuff. Food, transportation, access to drug treatment, even time with one's family. What we've inaugurated is what I write about as an economy of favors. This is the new catalog of disaster, to borrow from Baldwin, that fundamentally changes the nature of everyday interactions. This is because third parties now have incredible leverage. They're empowered by legal exclusion. Relationships that were once relations of care now start from a place of asymmetry, a different kind of asymmetry. where exchanges of everyday resources like a place to stay, for example, for the grandson who needs a place to live, is considered a favor because this person has to take great risk to allow it. The so-called ex-offender must therefore put others at ease. I enjoy spending time with a brother like you, he says to me as we walk in. I'm glad to do something positive, he says. He must put people at ease just to meet their basic human needs, in his case, to get to the appointment that keeps him out of jail. This new social arrangement has life or death consequences. So as we wrap things up, I want to talk about the three most important women in Jimmy's life to give you a sense of what this looks like in real time, to put flesh on the bones. I caught up with him at a construction site where he's doing demolition work for Gary. This is his old dope dealer who offers him a place to stay. We hopped in my car and drove to the Coney Island. This is west on Gratiot Avenue. And he orders his usual. He orders eggs, cooked sunny side up, grits, bacon, toast. I ordered my usual, a veggie omelet, hash browns. You know, I'm all about that healthy life or something like that. I'm making sure to check for the curly black hair I found in my breakfast the last time. So we drank weak coffee and orange juice, sitting across the table like two old friends catching up on less serious times. Jimmy was happy, and I was happy to see him. What's up with homegirl, I asked, thinking about his girlfriend. He had been with her for some time. She was a member of Pastor Smith's church. She was with him during his last two bits, sending him letters and putting money on his books. She did this without fail each month for years. Cynthia, he asked with a wry smile. After stints in the halfway houses and correctional institutions for most of his adult life, and at the right age of 47, Jimmy wanted to be free. Don't get me wrong, she was there for me, he said, before blurting out, I want me a hot girl, this is what he said. He was laughing, but he was serious. Jimmy was ready to move on. He wasn't attracted to Cynthia anymore. Maybe never was. She was in her 60s, and Jimmy, who was just a few months out from his last bit, wanted to date someone younger and more attractive, he told me. Someone he was excited to sleep with. And besides, he explained, her sister all in my business. This was bad for Jimmy. Cynthia and her sister were close. They were the kind of sisters that shared everything, and Cynthia's sister thought Jimmy was a user. He used most of Cynthia's disposable income, and he spent nights at her home, but only in between stays in detox or jail. He told me he had been clean for 3 years, but there was no evidence, according to Cynthia's sister, that things would ever change. She didn't trust him and told Cynthia to leave him often. And she said this to her sister while Jimmy was in earshot on more than one occasion. He told me he felt disrespected and that the feeling was familiar. I asked him why. He said she's like Tabitha. Now, this is Jimmy's middle sister. Tabitha was the one who kept her children away from Jimmy. She called him a crackhead and cursed him in front of his company. He hated how she treated him. He told me that he had a birthday, that the sisters had a birthday party the week before at his mother's apartment, and she knew Jimmy would be there. He loved his nieces and nephews, so she kept their toys downstairs in the car, he said, sighing heavier than before. And she announced this fact, that she kept the toys downstairs in the car because she said that Jimmy would steal them. Jimmy was embarrassed. She did this in front of the whole party. But this was an old problem. He got along well with his other sisters. Jimmy was the baby in the family, but he and Tabitha had been fighting since they were little. His mother used to settle their disputes, but he knew that he'd burned too many bridges, and he didn't want to get his mother involved. Since getting out of prison the last time, he can't come around her as much as he'd like to. Her landlord told her that if she let him stay there again, he would be forced to evict her. I don't really come around that no more, like that no more, Jimmy said, talking about his mother. I don't want to put her in that position. And it wasn't like he didn't need her. Jimmy certainly needed his mother. He was facing homelessness. He was struggling with his own addiction problems, trying to stay clean and sober. He was trying to get through all these programs. He didn't even have transportation to get around. He absolutely needed his mother, and his mother absolutely would provide him care if he turned to her for support. But he told me that he stayed away from her because she would provide the support. And if she did that, her landlord would evict her. The next time we connected, so I asked Jimmy, that's his mother, his sister, and his girlfriend. We connected again. I asked Jimmy about the relationship with the girlfriend. The girlfriend had gotten sick. She had had a stroke and was in a nursing home. And he told me that he was trying to figure out a way to marry her. This is the woman who he wanted to leave. So I'm like, well, Jimmy, I thought you wanted a hot girl. Like, Jimmy, what happened? You told me you were out. You told me you were leaving. And he said, she was there for me in prison all that time. I need to be there for her now, he said. He described his relationship as a kind of debt. When I dug a little deeper, he told me that he was tired of staying in the rundown houses for his old dope dealer that he was helping to rehab, that she provided him a warm place to stay, and he was trying to get married so he could figure out a way to get himself on the lease in the apartment. I asked Jimmy if he thought that his relationship with Cynthia would be different had he never gone to prison. He told me, yes, it's quite simply yes. All of his relationships with all the women that cared for him were mitigated by the fact of the prison. This is the economy of favors. It alters the nature of social life in the American city. It creates a power imbalance. It shapes even the most intimate of social relations. Jimmy's choice of sexual partners, for example. Jimmy's relationship with his mother, how often he sees her, whether or not he comes around, for example. And even if we think about this in terms of stigma, Jimmy's relationship with his sister